Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's debate. I'm your moderator, Laura Bradley, and tonight's debate will be filmed and available online at xt3.com. So keep that in mind. If you're asking a question, you will be recorded. Many thanks to Perusia Media, who has hosted Trent Horn, our affirmative speaker, all the way from the United States. Tonight's debate topic is, does God exist? In the affirmative position, we have Trent Horn. After his conversion to the Catholic faith, Trent Horn pursued an undergraduate degree in history from Arizona State University. He then earned a graduate degree in theology from the Franciscan University of Steubenville and is currently pursuing a graduate degree in philosophy from Holy Apostles College. Trent is a regular guest on the radio program Catholic Answers Live, a lecturer who speaks across the United States on issues related to the Catholic faith and the author of 2 books, Answering Atheism and Persuasive Pro-Life, both of which are published by Catholic Answers Press. This debate is brought to you by Perusia Media, which is an Australian distributor of Catholic resource materials and learning programs. Perusia Media are official partners with Catholic Answers. All of Trent's materials can be purchased through Perusia Media at www.perusiamedia.com or at the tables today. Trent is happy to sign books purchased here after this talk, so please take advantage of this opportunity. In the negative position is Raphael Lataster, a teaching fellow at the University of Sydney in Studies of Religion, and teaches on religion at various institutions. His main research interests include philosophy of religion, Christian origins, logic, Bayesian reasoning, sustainability, and alternative God concepts such as pantheism and pandeism. He is also an avid rock climber, a card-carrying Discordian pope, and an officially ordained Dudist priest. Raphael wrote his master's thesis on Jesus' historicity theories, concluding that historical and Bayesian reasoning justifies a skeptical attitude towards the historical Jesus. For his doctoral work, Raphael is analysing the major philosophical arguments for God's existence, as argued by William Lane Craig, Richard Swinburne, and Thomas Aquinas, and attempts to demonstrate the logical improbability of theism, exploring the theological tendencies of philosophy of religion and considering the plausibility of pantheistic worldviews. Raphael will also be selling his books after this debate and signing them. So the way tonight's debate will work is as follows. We'll have the affirmative opening statement, and that will go for 15 minutes, followed by the negative opening statements for 15 minutes. And we will have some visual clues for the speakers. So at 60 seconds, a yellow card will be held up. At 30 seconds, a blue card. And at 10 seconds, an orange card. If the speaker goes for longer than 15 minutes, I will ring this bell. And after 30 seconds, I will ask the speaker to conclude. Followed by the first affirmative rebuttal. That will go for 7 minutes. Again, we will use the visual audio cues at 1 minute, 30 seconds and 10 seconds, followed by a bell. And then the second affirmative rebuttal, followed by a second negative rebuttal, and that will go for 4 minutes. After that, we'll have cross-examination, which I will explain when we get to it. And then that will go for 8 minutes each, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. So, without further ado, our affirmative speaker, Trent Horn.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to thank the University of Sydney Catholic Club, the Catholic Society, for inviting me, and the Atheist Club for also partnering with this event. And I'd like to thank Raphael for agreeing to debate such an important topic. The question, does God exist, can be answered in one of 3 ways. Yes or probably yes, no or probably no, or I don't know. Since I have the affirmative in this debate, I will answer yes, and I expect my opponent will answer no or probably no, since he has the negative. It's not enough for Mr. Lataster to argue that there are no good reasons to believe God exists, since our question is not, is there evidence for God? The question is, does God exist? By God, I don't mean a man in the sky, or even just an invisible, powerful, cosmic person. I'm not talking about a reality in the universe that falls under the domain of science. Science is great, but it can't answer every question about what exists. Science can't prove or disprove the existence of immaterial, basic aspects of reality, like numbers, minds, or morality. What I'm talking about is one of those immaterial realities, the most basic reality that grounds all of existence, God, or pure, unlimited being that exists without deficiency and embodies all perfections and goodness. Since philosophy answers questions about fundamental aspects of reality, tonight you will see me present philosophical arguments for the existence of God. Now, a lot of people will say they will only believe in God if given evidence. Well, what kind of evidence? Well, regrowing an amputated limb, or having God appear in a cloud and tell the world, "Here I am." But those kinds of things could be explained naturally by advanced technology or hallucinations. In order to prove God exists, we would need to observe an effect that only God in principle could cause. So let me present 4 of those effects or reasons to believe that God exists. Reason number 1, the universe exists. Let's start with a basic principle. If something exists, and it doesn't have to exist, or it could be different, then there must be a reason for why it exists. This is called the principle of sufficient reason, and it is used in science, for example, all the time. After the 99th failed explanation, the scientist doesn't just say, "Forget it, there's no reason why this thing exists." Instead, the scientist says there must be a reason. We just haven't found it yet. If that's true for little things that don't have to exist, like a Higgs boson particle, then it must be true for anything that doesn't have to exist regardless of size, including the universe itself. But since the universe includes all the theories and facts that make up every scientific explanation, any explanation for the universe's existence will have to be philosophical and not scientific in nature. But maybe the universe has to exist, or it's necessary. The problem with this approach is that there is no reason to think the universe is necessary, and many reasons to think it's contingent, or it did not have to exist. For example, how could the universe be necessary if every part of the universe is contingent or could fail to exist? Second, it's very difficult to conceive of the non-existence of necessary things. You can think of a red triangle, but not a 4-sided one, because the number of a triangle's sides is necessary. But I can imagine a universe without our planet, or even no universe at all. As the renowned philosopher Derek Parfit writes, "It might have been true that nothing ever existed, no minds, no atoms, no space. When we imagine this possibility, it can seem astonishing that anything exists. Why is there a universe?" The answer to the question can't be another contingent universe, or even an infinite series of contingent things, because then we just have the same problem to explain. Why does this infinite series of things that doesn't have to exist? Instead, there must be a reality that is necessary, or a reality that exists by its very nature and could not be different and could not fail to exist. Well, that's the definition of God, pure existence, or being itself. Something that is pure, unlimited being would exist without limit or flaw and possess all perfections that are included in what it sustains, including perfect intellect and will, or what we call God. Reason number 2, the universe began to exist. Whenever something begins to exist, we rightly reason that there is a cause for that thing's existence. This is what we always observe, and it corresponds to the intuition that out of nothing, nothing comes. Besides, evidence for God that would satisfy atheists, like a regrown limb or another miracle, assumes that those events could not occur naturally by something coming from nothing. So if the universe, or all of space, time, matter, and energy, began to exist, then it would need a cause. Now, some might say maybe the cause is an alien, or another universe, or a scientific explanation. But remember, I said that if all physical reality, space, time, matter, and energy, began, then it needs a cause. The cause of the universe can't be material, because we're trying to explain the existence of material things. There could never, in principle, be a scientific explanation for the beginning of the universe from nothing, because scientific explanations involve formulas like E = mc squared, and the stuff you plug into the formulas. But if the universe came from absolute nothing, then there would be neither any theories nor any stuff to plug into the theories to explain it. Instead, the cause of the universe would exist beyond the spatial temporal order. But why believe there was an absolute beginning from nothing? Well, we have some evidence from science that leans in that direction, such as discoveries in theoretical physics that show an expanding universe, or even a multiverse, would have an absolute beginning in space and time. The respected physicists Audrey Matheny and Alexander Vilenkin write, "Did the universe have a beginning? At this point, it seems that the answer to this question is probably yes." We can also make a philosophical argument based on the impossibility of an infinite past. Suppose your Aunt Mildred owns a flower shop, and each day she has to count every flower before the shop opens. She has 100, no problem. 1,000,000,000,000 may take a little longer. How about an infinite number of flowers? Well, the shop never opens because Mildred never finishes. But if that's true, then if the past had an infinite number of days, and every day has to transpire before the present can exist, then just as every flower in the shop has to be counted before the shop opens, then the present will never happen just as the shop will never open. But there is a present, which means the past is not infinite, and instead there's a beginning of time that stands in need of explanation. But what is the cause of the universe? Well, if it created all of space and time, it can't be bound by those realities, so it must be immaterial and eternal. If it created something from nothing, then it must be all-powerful in order to bridge the gap between being, the infinite gap, I would say, between being and non-being. The cause must also be personal and not a mindless force because it chose to create a finite, temporally limited universe. An eternal, immaterial, all-powerful personal cause sounds a lot like God to me. Reason number 3. The universe contains predictable order. We know the laws of nature make our universe orderly and predictable. They include fundamental values or constants that have been finely tuned to allow complex life forms to exist. For example, the strength of gravity in a vacuum is fine-tuned to the 120th decimal place. The odds of this one constant being correct by chance alone are worse than the odds of finding a randomly marked atom somewhere in the known universe by chance alone. Just as you wouldn't write off a friend winning 10 games of poker in a row, all with royal flushes, as being due to chance, we should not explain an even more improbable universe by chance alone either. But perhaps the constants are necessary, and they have to be this way. First, that doesn't explain the huge coincidence, or as someone from my country would say, the huge coincidence, that the values we need to live happen to also be the necessary values of the constants in the laws of nature. As Richard Dawkins, the author of The God Delusion, says, it is indeed perfectly plausible for there to be only one way for a universe to be. But why did that one way have to be such a setup for our eventual evolution? Second, according to the philosopher of science Ernst Nagel, a demonstration of this necessity is lacking, since if the constants were necessary, we could put aside experiments to find their values and just use formulas like we do for the necessary truths in mathematics. So if necessity and chance do not explain these constants, then as the non-religious string theorist Leonard Susskind says, statistically miraculous events would be needed for our universe to be life-permitting. Susskind even suggests that, in light of this, it's possible that an unknown agent set the early conditions of the universe we observe today. Reason number 4. The universe contains intrinsic dignity and intrinsic evils. You can have morality with God just as you can have football without God, or footy for all of our Australians here today that I'm outnumbered by and glad to be with. You just get together, you make up some rules, and you agree to abide by them. My contention, however, is that there are certain moral facts or facts about the universe related to morality that cannot be explained apart from God. The famous atheist J.L. Mackie once put it this way: moral properties constitute so odd a cluster of properties and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. Now, you could just say, as Mackie did, that there are no moral facts, so God isn't needed to explain them. But I don't think most people really believe that. For example, if you say there are no moral facts or that morality is not objective, then that means when you say it's wrong to rape women, for example, all you're really saying is, I don't like raping women. But why should anyone care about what you like? Why should anyone let your personal preferences dictate their actions? But if what you mean is it is a fact you ought not treat women this way, then you have a fact about reality. You have objective morality. In addition, if moral facts did not exist, then it would be impossible to have moral discussions. As the atheistic philosopher Walter Sinnott Armstrong writes, we could never get started on everyday moral reasoning about any moral problem without relying on moral intuitions. Without some move like this, there would be no way to construct and justify any substantive moral theory. Plus, just as we normally are allowed to believe in things we perceive to exist unless there's a defeater that shows us the thing does not exist, then we're justified in believing moral facts exist unless someone can provide a defeater to show that they do not exist, because they seem just as real as the world and time and other minds that we perceive. Finally, a recent worldwide survey of philosophers shows that more than half believe that objective morality or moral facts exist. That doesn't prove they exist, but it shows that Mr. Lataster cannot dismiss objective morality as mere emotion. He needs an argument to show why such a popular theory, called moral realism, is wrong. That being said, there are two facts related to morality that are impossible to explain on naturalism: human equality and intrinsic evils. On the first fact, the secular philosopher Jeff McMahon admits that if humans were valuable because of their cognitive abilities, then, quote, our egalitarian commitments rest on distressingly insecure foundations. What McMahon means is that humans can't have equal rights if their rights are based on an unequally shared property like intelligence. Why not give 2 votes to smart people and half a vote to the less smart? Why not treat disabled newborns, even mildly disabled ones such as Down syndrome babies, like other disabled animals of a similar cognitive level, and euthanize them? However, if humans are valuable because they are made in the image of that which is perfect goodness itself, or God, then we have a compelling reason to value cognitively deficient humans like infants or the disabled over cognitively superior non-human animals. Even though humans differ in many important ways, they would all be equal in dignity and basic rights because they would each have the same immaterial intrinsic value bestowed on them by a God that is a source of intrinsic value and perfect goodness. Second, only a perfectly good God can explain the existence of commands to avoid behavior that is always evil, no matter the consequences. For example, it is always wrong to rape someone, even if that act brought about greater good, such as appeasing a violent warlord from burning down a village. But if morality is only about practical greater goods, then there is no reason not to do terrible, awful things to other humans in order to achieve that good end. But if morality comes from God, who is by nature perfect goodness itself, then we have a reason to not treat humans in ways that violate the natures God gave them. So in conclusion, I believe there are many good reasons to believe God exists, and no comparably good reasons to believe God does not exist. These reasons won't persuade everyone, but no argument in philosophy has ever been that effective. Instead, I think reasonable people can accept these reasons and use them as a stepping stone to explore the reality of God, the infinite source of truth and goodness, and the ultimate explanation for the question of meaning and purpose each of us seeks in our own lives. Thank you very much.
For his opening statement, please give a round of applause to Raphael.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you, Trent, for proposing this debate. I'm definitely keen to debate you. I think you present a relatively good case for theism, and I wish Trent well. I think if he's convinced me, I'll definitely convert. And just a quick shout out to William Lane Craig. There's a seat there for him. He refuses to debate me, but he did the same thing to Dawkins, and Dawkins ordered me to do it, and he is kind of the Pope of atheism. All right, so I'm not a theist, I am an atheist, which means to me non-theist, so I reject the challenge that Trent has presented, basically that I need to argue against God's existence. I definitely reject that. I am agnostic. You can call me agnostic if you like, it doesn't bother me. It doesn't really absolve the theist of their responsibilities. However, I actually think I can go pretty close to arguing against the theistic concept of God anyway. So here we go. Arguments for God. Now, as Trent indicated, the God we're talking about is not just any generic God. It's a specific type of God, the God of classical theism. That's the God that's all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, creator of the universe, necessary, desires a relationship with mankind, and so forth. There's probably 7 to 9 of the qualities there. So the first argument that we saw was, I'm going to race through these because I've actually got to present my own case, and this really doesn't matter all that much once you see my case. The contingency argument, we don't actually know that the world is contingent. We also don't know that God is necessary. That's a problem when we're talking about deductive arguments. As for the issue of why is there something rather than nothing, some philosophers have also said, pantheistic philosophers, why is there nothing rather than something? Very crude, running through these, it won't matter in the end. We've heard basically the first cause argument. Again, we don't know that the universe actually began to exist. As for the scientific arguments, I think we heard the Big Bang argument. The Big Bang doesn't actually prove that the universe came into existence from nothing. It shows that the universe underwent a period of expansion about 14 billion years ago. That's all it tells us. The rest, we don't know. And if you want to talk about Bode, Guth, Vilenkin, actually Guth was horrified that apologists use this paper in that way, and he says he thinks the universe is eternal. And Vilenkin actually also opposes this, and this became a big thing between Craig and Krauss, actually. Also, with this argument, substance dualism is simply assumed, and we can't allow that. We have no evidence for substance dualism or the nothingness whatsoever, so we can just skip past that. Also, the philosophical arguments for the first cause argument, they rely on a tensed view of time. We don't know that that's actually true. Time could be tenseless, and in fact, most philosophers of time do think that time is tenseless. Moving on to fine-tuning. A lot of problems with these. The biggest problem I have, especially with the way Trent structured the argument, seems to be the same way that William Lane Craig structures the argument. You've got these three options here. We don't have any evidence for them. No evidence for necessity, no evidence for chance. You know what? Intelligent design wins by default. It seems very arbitrary. You could put intelligent design right at the start and say, okay, no evidence for intelligent design, no evidence for necessity. There you go. It must be chance. So there's a lot of problems with that. There's also, I think, some misunderstanding of how probability works. And really, there's never been a good argument to say that the universe isn't necessary, and it doesn't have to be in this way. And there's also some issues there with assuming that it is all about us. There's no evidence whatsoever that changing the constants couldn't yield some other form of life. All right, moral argument. This, I think, is probably the worst of the traditional theistic arguments. We don't know that objective morality exists, nor do we know, I don't think if you brought up the premise, but nor do we know that if objective morality exists, it has anything to do with God. It could just be part of the constants of the universe, part of the fine-tuning of the universe, which may have come about through chance or necessity. Also, it's quite interesting that Trent appealed to our emotions, basically, to our subjectivity, to prove that objective morals exist. He says, I don't think most people would object to that. So that is a bit of a problem when you're arguing for something objective by referring to the subjective. Also, there's a problem with inscrutability of God, but we'll skip through that. It's not too important now. We didn't do ontological argument. We didn't do experience argument. Others, blah, blah, blah. It's all pointless. We didn't do Jesus. Here we go. Here we go. Let's skip through. Excellent. We're making good time. Now, if these are deductive arguments, I don't need to prove that the premises are false. I just need to not accept them. That's how logical reasoning works. Otherwise, I could say something silly like, here's an argument, if God doesn't exist, then God doesn't exist. Premise 2, God doesn't exist. Conclusion, therefore, God doesn't exist. You need to prove that premise 2 is wrong. Premise 1 is obviously right. If you can't prove premise 2 is wrong, the argument is successful. That's not how it works. I wouldn't make such a silly argument. You actually have to have premises that we all agree on, otherwise it's not a good argument. You need uncontroversial premises leading to what would be a controversial conclusion. But if we don't accept the premises, the argument doesn't work. Now, as a deductive case, it definitely fails. But it could work as a probabilistic case. I think Trent, I don't know where he feels on that, but it seems like he didn't want to go down that path. But I think you do need a probabilistic case. What is the probability? Where is the calculation? He didn't provide it. We also need to factor in the evidence against, which didn't come up. And we also need to factor in alternative explanations. These arguments could work and lead to alternatives. So even if it's a deductive case, it's not a deductive case for theism. It's a deductive case for a generic supernaturalism. So in the end, you do need to make a probabilistic case after all, because you need to factor in all the alternatives, all the supernaturalistic alternatives, which we will get to. First, arguments against God. I bring 2. You can actually flip all the traditional arguments for theism and make them arguments against God, like fine-tuning. Very easy to do there. But argument from hiddenness. If there's an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful, revelatory God, then it wouldn't make sense that you'd have people like me. I'm a non-resistant non-believer. I don't hate religion. I don't hate God. I'd be quite happy to be a believer. I love Christians. I date Christians. So it's not a problem for me if Christianity it's not a problem if Christianity turned out to be true. And excuses for this don't actually raise the probability. It raises the consequent probability, but it lowers the prior probability. So there's no effect on the overall probability. In fact, it could lower it as you bring in more ad hoc assumptions that are completely unjustified. So this evidence, the evidence from divine hiddenness, is actually a probabilistic point for naturalism. It doesn't prove that God doesn't exist, but if everything else is kept equal, it definitely moves the scale towards naturalism. There are other isms to consider as well, which is the big part here. But the next argument is the argument from evil, or we should call it gratuitous suffering, since many of us don't believe in objective evil. Again, it doesn't make sense with an all-good God that gratuitous suffering, yeah, but gratuitous suffering, it doesn't make sense. This is a point for naturalism again. Once again, excuses don't help because they don't adjust the probability here. And appealing to God's mystery would actually end the probabilistic analysis. If you say, well, there's things about God that we just don't know, you could say that about any concept. So that ends the probabilistic analysis. Done. We might as well go home. So that's a probabilistic point for naturalism, but the biggest point is there are supernaturalistic alternatives. There are many other isms. Now, naturalism, I think, wins because it's less ad hoc. You don't need the nothing. You don't need substance dualism. But let's grant supernaturalism. I'm a nice guy. I'm going to say, you know what? He's convinced me supernaturalism is true. There are infinitely many supernaturalistic alternatives that are inherently more plausible on the prior probability side of the equation and that explain the evidence better. That's the consequent probability or likelihood side of the equation, or both. That is a major problem for classical theism, and I do not accept any false dichotomies that says it's theism versus atheism, whatever that is, or theism versus naturalism. That's not the case. There's a lot of other isms. Here we go. Naturalism, supernaturalism, there's theism. It's only one part of supernaturalism. There's Christianity somewhere there. It's one part of theism. Trent has his work cut out for him. First challenge, polytheisms. There are infinitely many polytheistic alternatives to monotheism, which are not obviously less probable. Now, apologists like Craig and Swinburne tend to appeal to simplicity, but this is not proven. Simplicity in terms of how many gods there are. But this is not necessarily, this hasn't been proven actually to be truth conducive. And if it is, by how much? If we don't know, Trent hasn't actually given us the figures here, we need to invoke the principle of indifference. Once we do that, we look at, okay, we've got the one God concept, the two God concept, the three God concept, the four God concept, and so forth. How many are there? Thousands, billions, millions? We say, well, probability of monotheism starts approaching zero. So polytheism, as a catch-all hypothesis, should be preferred. But it gets worse. Not only will I grant supernaturalism, I will also grant monotheism. So you don't actually have to answer the polytheism if you don't want to. Let's get to alternative monotheisms. Theism is only one of the monotheisms that are available. There are infinitely many monotheistic alternatives, such as the evil God, the less good God, the morally indifferent God, the weak God, the stupid God, and so forth. How do you deal with this? How do you say that theism is elevated above all these? Once again, apologists appeal to simplicity, saying, well, you know, it's better to have a God that's infinite in goodness and in power rather than having an arbitrary stopping point. Again, we don't have any proof that this is related to the truth. And if so, how does this affect the probability? Trent didn't explain that to us. And also, this actually does nothing to the deisms. As a subset of alternative monotheisms, you can basically say, okay, let's think of the same God, one that is not a revelatory being. And that actually works better with the evidence of divine hiddenness. Not only was that a point for naturalism, it's a point for deism. So deism's the God that doesn't reveal itself to us. And quasi-deisms, the gods that do not reveal themselves to human. Maybe they are revelatory God, but to other species. Who knows? So these alternatives, it's a robust hypothesis. And yeah, theism can't even be said to be the best monotheism. There's another problem. I think the biggest problem of all comes from the pantheisms. These are the ones I research quite a bit. Again, there are infinitely many pantheistic options, including panentheism and pandeism. Now, these options basically say that the world is divine. It's either God or part of God. It doesn't assume, it's less ad hoc than theism. It doesn't assume substance dualism. It doesn't assume creatio ex nihilo. It doesn't assume the nothingness. It doesn't assume the unembodied mind. All these things that theism assumes, pantheisms do not assume. In that sense, they are actually less ad hoc. They have a higher prior probability. And they are robust. It's a catch-all hypothesis again, so there's so many of them compared to the one theism that Trent believes in. And also you can mix and match these various theories. You can mix deism with pantheism and have a super concept like pandeism, which wins against theism in a probabilistic analysis on the prior side of the equation and on the consequent side of the equation. Or I've got an example here. What about a morally indifferent pan-polydeism, which sounds very complex, but it actually deals with those arguments against God, it works with the arguments for God, and it's something that looks completely different from pantheism, and it's less ad hoc, than theism, it's less ad hoc. Jesus we didn't do, unfortunately, so we won't see that. Or my argument from Meriguz, blah, blah, blah. All right, so basically, I've revealed the inadequacies of Horn's case, and just for the heck of it, I've actually shown that there's a lot of challenges to the theist, even if we accept that supernaturalism is true. So I think what Horn needs to do, I sort of grant that he'd make a probabilistic case. I'm very skeptical about his deductive intentions. But if he has to make a probabilistic case, even if they are good deductive arguments, because they didn't lead to theism, you've got to factor in the alternatives. So he does need a probabilistic case in the end, unless he can prove that the alternatives just can't work at all, which I'm very skeptical about. So I think that the probabilistic case that he has made, if he has one, is actually a massive failure. The evidence against God's existence was ignored. The many alternatives to theism were completely overlooked, and the probability of God's existence was undisclosed. We didn't actually get the probability, which basically is the possibility fallacy. He's appealed to possibility rather than probability, which you could say is an appeal to ignorance in a sense. So I think he's basically got to start over. If it's deductive arguments, if it's a deductive case for theism, he actually has to argue for theism, and he has to give us premises that we're all going to accept. We need uncontroversial premises. And if it's a probabilistic case, well, he needs a proper probabilistic analysis. We've got to get our Bayesian reasoning on. And I think that's all from me for now. Thank you very much.
We will now open it up to the first affirmative rebuttal. Trent.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's what we call a shotgun approach to an argument. I'm just going to spray everything out there and hope something hits the target. Well, I think you'll see that the target remains unscathed. First, Mr. Lataster said we must use inductive arguments to prove conclusions, not deductive ones like my arguments. But notice that Raphael did not present any argument, either deductive or inductive, for that conclusion. In fact, the philosopher T. Edward Damer writes in his textbook on logical fallacies, moral questions lend themselves to the deductive form of argument, which means that moral arguments could be appropriately construed as being among the strongest of arguments. So actually, deductive arguments are very strong. I presented evidence in my deductive arguments, and Raphael just kind of hand-waved away the evidence. He didn't show that it didn't follow to the conclusion, as we will see. Second, I didn't argue from possibility to probability. I said that we have reasons in the universe that, if you logically follow them, go back to a necessary and unlimited being. Mr. Lataster also said that my arguments contain presuppositions that some people don't accept, or that in order for my arguments to work, everyone has to accept the premises. Well, anyone can deny a premise in an argument. 7% of people think humans didn't land on the moon. Nothing's going to convince everybody. Mr. Lataster's arguments don't have 100% support in his premises either. Instead, he needs to show that a reasonable person can reject my premises, and so far he just hasn't done that. Let's look at the contingency argument. He said there's no reason to think the universe is necessary, but I gave several reasons in my opening statement, like from the possibility of non-existence, or the argument from the universe being a collection of contingent objects, so that reply fails. He also said there's no reason to think God is necessary, but God, by definition, is infinite necessary being. I'm not defining God into existence. I'm saying, hey, could there be a necessary being that grounds all of reality? Maybe yes, maybe no. Let's debate that. You can't just say, well, hold on, how do we know he's necessary? That's part of the definition of the thing whose existence we are debating. He also said, well, why aren't we arguing, why is there something rather than nothing? We could argue, why is there nothing rather than something? The principle of sufficient reason deals with things that exist require reasons for why they exist. A state of absolute nothingness requires no explanation because it has nothing existing in it. Let's go to my first cause argument. Mr. Lataster said we couldn't know if the universe began to exist from nothing, but I provided scientific evidence and philosophical arguments, and the philosophical arguments have not been touched. When it comes to the scientific evidence, he says, well, there's some theoretical physicists who deny the universe had a beginning. But actually, if you look closer in their writings, such as the writings of Alexander Vilenkin, he agrees that at the moment time equals 0 is a special moment, no less special than a true beginning of the universe itself. And he hasn't really given us any more scientific evidence to show the universe is eternal or to contradict what we see from things like the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. Mr. Lataster also tried to refute the first cause argument by saying it relies on a fringe A theory of time. We don't know if that theory is correct or philosophers don't accept it. He's arguing for the B theory and said, well, guess what, folks? Only 26% of philosophers accept the B theory of time that he says competes with my theory. I also find it rich that someone says my argument relies on a fringe theory from someone who wrote a book that Jesus didn't exist, which among historians is the fringe of the fringe of the fringe. So I think that's very humorous. Let's move on with that. So I think that was just hand-waving. We haven't seen any arguments that show the first cause argument doesn't exist, nor have we seen any arguments to show that the theory of time underlying the first cause argument is wrong. In regards to fine-tuning, Mr. Lataster misformulated the argument. I gave evidence for why the constants are neither necessary nor caused by chance alone. I gave evidence for that, so that would lead to design. And he hasn't really responded to that, so I think the argument still stands just fine. Let's look at the moral argument. When it comes to morality, Raphael just dismissed the concept of objective morality, says, well, we can only know it with our subjective thoughts. We can only know anything with subjective thoughts. That means mathematics couldn't be objective because we only know math through our subjective thoughts in math class. But I gave evidence from people's understanding of morality, and just as we conclude that the passage of time is real or the external world is real by the fact that we perceive it, then we're justified in perceiving that moral facts exist. If moral facts existed, which are immaterial, what would they look like? Well, they would look like many people saying they exist. So the way reality is accurately describes my view that there's objective moral truth, not Raphael's. In fact, his own arguments presuppose objective morality because he says, well, there's gratuitous suffering, so God doesn't exist. What do you mean by gratuitous? I'm guessing they're suffering that there's no good reason. What do you mean a good reason? As in you're being bad or evil for allowing this suffering? Look, that's objective evil. If we define evil as the way things are not supposed to be, then it follows there's a way things are supposed to be. So evil, rather than being evidence against God, is actually indirect evidence for him. Finally, he said that my theory doesn't work because there's an infinite number of alternative possibilities. And I would say that's actually not true. I've shown why the arguments lead to the God of theism, especially the contingency argument and Kalam arguments, and they all come together to show that the cause of reality cannot be limited in any way. Otherwise, it would stand in need of an explanation itself. Any ultimate explanation or necessary reality would have to be free from any deficiencies, flaws, or limits. So if there were other deities that would compete with this ultimate reality, and it wouldn't be ultimate. It couldn't be the necessary explanation for all things. So I think the contingency argument especially shows there can't be other deities. The fact also that the laws of nature are uniform and predictable, and things aren't chaotic when it comes to laws like gravity, shows we don't have competing deities mucking around with everything. It shows rather that there's a universal sense of order in the universe that would flow from one universal source. He said, well, why not pantheism? Well, pantheism fails because if God were identical to the universe, then he would have to cause himself to come into existence, which is as contradictory as saying Mark Zuckerberg got the idea for Facebook from a Facebook message he received. It doesn't make any sense. Likewise, deism fails because I gave evidence that God is unlimited being and perfect goodness itself, attributes that the God of deism lacks. So I think in the end that the arguments for God don't succeed, and the evidence that I presented tonight was just kind of hand-waved away, and the arguments for theism remain stalwart, and it's reasonable to believe that God does exist. Thank you.
I'm not having to do any bell ringing yet, so that's great. Welcoming up Raphael for his rebuttal.
All right, well, I have bad news to report. Unfortunately, there will be no conversion tonight. I wasn't exactly convinced with the case. The first thing in the rebuttal that Trent said was that I didn't make arguments. I made plenty of arguments. These were the challenges, basically, that there are all these alternative explanations that are superior to theism on the prior probability side of the equation and the consequent probability side of the equation. So they're actually more probable, arguably, than theism. And if less probable, you need to show how that works in the probability distribution. You can't just assume theism is the best one, okay, it's probable. It doesn't work that way. You need to do a proper analysis. Now, most of what Trent said focuses on the arguments for God that he presented, so I can just skip ahead to all that because I said I'm quite willing to drop that and move on to the alternative explanations. That was my main focus. Of course, I don't agree with just about anything he said regarding those arguments. For example, that the argument from evil basically assumes morality. That's not how probabilistic reasoning works. You consider, if God exists, what do you expect to see? You're not actually saying, okay, God exists and morality exists. That was all a bit silly, but we can move from that. There was a lot of hand-waving going on from Trent because the focus really should be on the alternatives, such as the alternative monotheisms, such as the deisms, such as the pantheisms. So I don't think I'm actually going to take much time here. I do want to say I think it's an ad hominem argument to mention my work on Jesus. That's been peer-reviewed. I've been published in Cambridge on that. The university has supported me on that. I'm technically a Jesus agnostic as well. I'm not a fringe mythicist. And actually, New Testament historians are increasingly saying that this is getting into the mainstream now, like Crossley has said in his recent book, James Crossley, famous New Testament scholar. He said actually these questions are really coming into the mainstream of New Testament research. But that's irrelevant. We didn't discuss Jesus here tonight, so I think that was very poor form to bring that up. Now, as for the alternative supernaturalistic hypotheses that I was obviously quite keen to point out, most of the focus there seemed on polytheism, which again I was willing to grant monotheism just for the sake of argument. So we're left, say, with the deisms and the pantheisms. I didn't hear anything remotely close to being cogent about deism. I mean, that is not something that you can just wave your hand at. Deism is a serious rival to theism, and so are the quasi-deisms. Now, Trent hasn't actually given us any good reason why the God that exists in his view would actually have to reveal God's self to humans. That argument hasn't been made. Nor has it been said that that is a simpler or less ad hoc explanation. Not at all. If anything, it's more ad hoc because it assumes something else about God that doesn't have to be. So you're taking a smaller segment of the probability distribution. As for pantheism, saying that God caused himself into existence, I completely reject that because I don't necessarily accept that the world came into existence. The universe could be eternal, and pantheism works perfectly with that. The only thing I think that would go against pantheism, remember I brought the challenge when I said that there's all these alternatives. They are catch-all hypotheses. It's not just one. There's not just one pantheism. There's not one polytheism. There's not one alternative monotheism. There's not one quasi-deism. There's basically infinitely many of them. And it's a really hard thing to try and prove theism true when you've got all these alternatives and you can't rule them out in a deductive way, and you've got to make a probabilistic analysis, which Trent didn't provide. I think the case for theism just can't even start there. But with pantheism, it works with, or the pantheistic concepts, it works with basically all the evidence that is possible, except I think for creatio ex nihilo, yet that is something that has not been proven at all. We are not sure that there is substance dualism, that there was a nothing, that there's an unembodied mind. We have no evidence for that whatsoever. So pantheism is less ad hoc. It is simpler in that sense, and it wins on the consequent side of the equation as well when you start mixing it with the other concepts that deal with the argument from gratuitous suffering and from hiddenness. And I think the argument from hiddenness was pretty much overlooked, which is unfortunate, because that is a serious issue. And I'll point to myself as well here. I did use myself as an example. I'm a non-resistant non-believer. If God exists, I want to know it. And if God exists, unlike Hitchens, who was an anti-theist, and I respect his view was basically, if I knew God existed, I'd still hate him because he's a jerk. I say, okay, I respect you for that. I don't agree with that approach, but I respect him for it. I would say, no, I would follow God. Okay, so I'm actually quite willing to believe in God. I just need God to convince me of it. And so far, he hasn't done that. And that disturbs me. If salvation is important, if God is all good, he would want to save me. If he's all powerful, he has the ability to do so. And if he's all knowing, he would know what it takes to convince me, even if I don't know, even if you don't know, even if Trent doesn't know, amputation or whatever. God would know. And yet God hasn't done it. And that disturbs me. That says to me, well, there either is no God, or there's a different kind of God. There could be an evil God. There could be a morally indifferent God. There could be a deistic God, one that's not interested in the revelation. So these alternatives like deism, pantheism, alternative monotheism, even the polytheisms without probabilistic argument, they haven't really been dealt with. So I'll finish early. There's nothing more for me to deal with. I came here, we agreed we would discuss theism. Basically, Trent has argued for supernaturalism. He hasn't argued for theism, and that's the problem. So deductive or probabilistic, you still need to do calculations in the end. You need to factor in all the alternatives, and you need to weigh up the probabilities. None of that he's done. And I think actually no one's done this. This is what's novel about my research. And there are two of the articles is already out. I have a series of articles coming out in the top international philosophy of religion journals on these problems. These are serious problems that theists have to deal with. For too long, we've let theists get away with the false dichotomy of basically Christian theism versus atheism, whatever that is. And we need to actually take the others seriously. Not only for naturalists in the audience, but in case there's any pagans in the audience, I hear you. We need to take pantheism and other concepts seriously. All right, thank you.
The next round of rebuttals will go for 4 minutes each, so opening it up to Trent.
First, I'll say that I think the argument from evil, Raphael's basically just given up on that, being able to show God doesn't exist. And the argument from hiddenness, my reply to that would be that the burden of proof is on him to show that the fact that some people don't believe in God is incompatible with belief in God, and he hasn't made that burden. That's an atheist argument. The burden is completely on him. All I have to do is provide possible reasons. Are there possible reasons God would let some people have non-belief? Sure, he may want believers to share in the goodness of sharing belief in God with others. He may want people to be able to freely choose God. If God just was always hovering over us, watching us, the choice to follow him would be as free as the choice to drive the speed limit when there's a cop following you on the freeway. So I think that there can be good reasons God hasn't revealed himself to everyone, but many people have experienced God. Once again, he has not shown that God could have no reasons for allowing himself allowing some people not to believe. And my theistic tradition, the Catholic Church, teaches that if people don't believe in God through no fault of their own, they're not automatically damned. So God can still save those who don't believe out of invincible ignorance. Moving on a little bit, he says, I didn't show that theism was a superior hypothesis. What about pantheism, deism? He just listed all of these. Note, I think it's kind of humorous that we're talking a lot about deism, pantheism. Atheism doesn't seem to be a really strong contender tonight. We're just debating about which gods are out there. So I would say, though, that I did give evidence from the contingency argument shows the ultimate explanation that's necessary has to be unlimited, otherwise it wouldn't be necessary. There'd be a contingent reality to it. And the moral argument showed that this reality would have to be perfect goodness itself, something that is not compatible with polytheism or deism, a kind of watchmaker that doesn't care or doesn't have any moral properties. And you could say, well, those arguments don't prove that, but Raphael basically gave up addressing my contingency argument. He'd also dropped my argument for morality and fine-tuning. He hasn't addressed any of the evidence that I've presented for that. So I think we have good reason to believe that there is a necessary foundation of reality that's pure, unlimited being that sustains all of existence, God, and that this God is personal, it designed the universe, and this God is perfect goodness itself, since moral standards ultimately flow from God. And we haven't heard any argument against the moral argument, either showing that moral facts don't exist or that they don't come from God. Now he did say, well, they could just exist out there. But the problem is moral facts are not like natural facts. The law of gravity says if you push grandma off the cliff, she will accelerate, depending on the height you push her. But the law of morality, natural laws describe the way things are. Moral laws describe the way things ought to be. And as I showed in the quote from Mackey, way things ought to be is incompatible with an atheistic, purposeless universe. If things ought to be a certain way, that is evidence of a cosmic plan, or a cosmic planner, who we would call God. I'm also going to say that when I brought up your work with Jesus, I wasn't making an ad hominem attack. I wasn't saying there's something bad about my opponent and that he's wrong. I was just noticing it's funny that his only argument against my first cause argument was that it relies on a theory of time that a minority of philosophers accept, even though the majority of philosophers haven't weighed in on theories of time. So he was critiquing my argument because only a minority of people accept it. But really, it's not even that small of a minority. About 15% of philosophers, 25% for the competing theory. So it's still a very viable theory that many people accept. So I think it's funny, that's his only argument against my first cause, is that a minority of scholars accept it, and yet he's written an entire book and defended a position that's extremely fringe and extremely minority. I'm not denigrating his work, I'm just saying that, just as Raphael would say, we can't discover truth by counting heads with Jesus, we can't do it by counting heads with God, we have to examine the evidence, and the evidence tonight, I think, shows that God does exist.
Raphael, you have now 4 minutes to rebut.
All right. Well, I can't believe I have to keep saying this, but we don't have to talk about the arguments for and against God anymore, because I said I'm willing to accept them and grant supernaturalism, so that the focus should be really on how you elevate theism from the supernaturalisms. But if I have to, I will say it again and again and again. As for atheism, Trent thinks I need to argue for atheism. What's atheism? I'm an agnostic. Atheism means non-theism. That's what the A means, not theism. I'm not a theist. What do I have to defend? I'm here to critique his case for theism. In the end, I actually gave good reasons to think that theism is very improbable. But I don't have to try and prove that there is no God. I think he might mean naturalism. I think that's the term maybe we should be using instead of atheism. But I'm not a hard naturalist. I'm a de facto naturalist, and I'm an agnostic. So I don't actually have to prove that God doesn't exist. But it is interesting that theism cannot be elevated above the other supernaturalisms. That's very relevant, and that's something that theists haven't yet dealt with. As for the issue of divine hiddenness and being a non-resistant non-believer, once again we're getting to excuses, and I explain these excuses do not help the theist, because they do make it more likely, they do make theism more likely, that's on the consequence side of the equation, but it actually lowers the prior probability. So overall, there's no change. And if you're going to make excuses, if you're basically alluding to the inscrutability of God, well, that applies to every concept. So that is no defense. I don't have to prove that. I'm just making a probabilistic case, and that is no defense. Also, the issue of divine hiddenness, I think that's the last thing that I'll mention now. I don't need to use all my time here. I think Trent is basically confusing divine ontology with our freedom to choose to follow God. You can actually believe that God exists and choose not to follow him. I gave the Hitchens example. But this actually has biblical precedent as well. Satan and the fallen angels. They knew who God was. They knew who God is. More than we possibly could. And yet they still chose not to follow God. So it's not an infringement on our free will if God makes it obvious to us that we exist. Basically, Trent wants God to keep us in ignorance. That's absurd. God should give us the best chance that we can possibly have. There's no problem with God allowing us all to know that God exists. We still have to make the choice whether we are going to follow God or not. I haven't been in that position because God hasn't revealed himself to me. But if he did, I would choose to follow him. And that's about it. That's all I need. I think we need to take the alternatives to theism a lot more seriously. We need some proper probabilistic analyses here. Trent refuses to do so. I can't make him. All right, thank you for that.
So now we get to cross-examination. Each speaker will be allowed 8 minutes to ask questions of his opponent. The speaker asking the questions is allowed to control the flow of the conversation, and as such is permitted to interrupt his opponent or rephrase questions in order to do that. This is not considered rude or bad form. The cross-examination round will begin with Mr. Horn's questions for Mr. Lataster.
All right. Well, it looks like our debate is now, all the other arguments have fallen to the wayside, and we're just talking about divine hiddenness. So it seems to me your argument is, if God existed, there would be no reasonable non-belief. What evidence do you have to support that premise?
I don't say that. I'm making a probabilistic argument. I'm saying that that would be more expected on naturalism. Obviously, if naturalism is true, you would expect to find zero evidence of God. That's obvious. If God exists, and God wants you to know God exists, that relationship is not 100%. So that is a point for naturalism. I don't have to prove anything. This is a probabilistic point. But it's not just a point for naturalism. It's also a point for deism. On deism, also, you would expect to see no evidence of God's existence, because God doesn't want to reveal itself to you.
If God did exist, would you expect that there are people who would believe in him?
If God did exist,
would you expect there would be people who believe in him?
I would expect people to believe in him. If it's the God of theism, yes. If it's the God of deism, no. Although they still could because of evolutionary.
Okay. So it seems like it would be pretty even then, because if you're saying, well, there's a point for naturalism that some people don't believe, there's a point for theism because many people, the majority of people, do believe.
No, it is not even. Basically, we see with our scientific approach, empirical methods, we do not see any direct evidence of God's existence. That is 100%
what would constitute evidence of God's existence?
God actually showing up.
What would that look like?
Hey, I'm here.
Wait, hold on. I want to get a specific. So you're saying, like, if a big, gigantic man came down and said, "Here I am"?
That's a start.
Why would you say that that's God? Wouldn't you, who seek alternative explanations, say that's more likely to be an alien?
Raphael, can you keep the microphone to you?
Okay, the first, I have 4 responses to that. The first is basically, I've got to keep it closer. I'm not sure it's my job to figure it out for you. That I don't necessarily accept. My second response is, I don't know, is actually a valid response.
No, I'm going to stop you right there, because you're saying if God existed, there would be evidence. I asked you, well, what would that look like? And you said, well, I don't have to tell you what it would be.
I'm explaining to you now. The third response is, if I don't know what that is, and there is a certain someone who knows what that is, they would know what to do. So they would be able to do that directly. And the fourth is the amputee example. You brought it up yourself. And I also say, I mean, this is an interesting one here. If I saw a prophetic figure like Jesus come back to life, that would probably convince me.
So why would a limb regrowing from nothing, why would that convince you God exists?
Not just a limb growing from nothing. It's a specific scenario. If you were to pray for somebody and you did that in the name of Jesus, I don't want you doing it in the name of Lockie or whatever. If you're praying in the name of Jesus and within 10 seconds, their limb grows back, I would say, wow, there's something special going on here.
How do you know that it's the God of theism and not some advanced technology or some alien force or someone else or a trickster god like Loki acting in the name of Jesus? How do you rule out all of those other possibilities?
You know what? You make a fantastic point. That's fantastic. I wish all the people in the New Testament had that attitude. But when they saw Jesus heal people, they believed in Jesus.
Okay, so I'm
like
asking for you though, because what is it about? Are you saying that the limb coming from nothing would convince you because something can't come from nothing?
No.
But why would it convince you? Why wouldn't you just say it's a neat parlor trick?
That is something. A limb regrowing back.
Why?
Has a very low prior probability. This is something that we do not observe happening. And the whole point of miracles, and this is supposed to be evidence of God doing something, is that something that's incredibly improbable starts happening. Now, I know there are naturalistic explanations. Everyone has their
So you would accept the limb regrowing because it's incredibly improbable. We don't observe it anywhere. If we just observed a limb from nothing once, that would be enough, because we don't observe it anywhere else.
I mean, I could come up with these naturalistic explanations, but you know what? If Jesus did it, or if there was a prophet doing that, I would say, God or no God, I think I'm going to follow that person.
Okay, well,
this
I guess
person
for
has
me
amazing power.
If a limb...
It might not be evidence of God. I agree with you there. But I think, okay, this is a person worth taking seriously. I'm going to follow this person. That's how religion starts.
So if an arm coming to be from nothing is evidence for God, why not a whole universe from nothing?
Well, I'm not saying that it would be evidence for God. I'm saying that I would be quite impressed with that and I might follow that person.
So isn't that the meaning of evidence? That it makes you want to follow that person?
Being, that is a completely that is a non sequitur, really, because as I said, that can work with other theories as well. And we have zero evidence for that happening. I don't accept that.
Do you have any evidence that the universe is eternal or infinite in the past?
No.
Okay, so I've presented evidence.
I'm an honest agnostic. I say there's no evidence that the universe was created, especially from nothing, and there's no evidence that the universe is eternal. I'm an agnostic on the matter.
Well, did you address my evidence tonight that it's finite, like the philosophical argument or even the scientific argument?
Yes, I did, and I'm glad you brought it up because I wanted to address that when you said that, say, 26% of people or so, only 26% accepted the B theory of time. I didn't say the B theory of time. I referred to eternalist theories. The B theory is one of those theories, but the majority actually goes against the A theory of time. I'm not saying that proves it. I mean, you're right. If I was just appealing to the popularity, I agree. Truth is not a democracy. That doesn't prove it. But what that says is that it is a live option. It is a live option, and when you're making deductive arguments, you need to be sure. And that's why there's an issue here between are you making a deductive case or are you making a probabilistic case? If you're making a deductive case, you have to be 100% sure that your premises are correct.
Why can't
and we are not sure.
Why do I have to be 100%
began.
sure? Why can't I just say the premises are more likely to be true than false?
Well, then that's a probabilistic case.
Wait, what's your argument? You can't give us a foolproof argument against deductive arguments.
A foolproof argument against deductive arguments. What are you asking for?
Well, what you're saying is that I can't use deductive arguments unless there's 100% certainty in the premises. Well, are there any other examples in philosophy of arguments like that?
We define what good arguments are. The whole point of a good argument is to use premises that are uncontroversial. We, philosophers.
But I cited a philosopher who said deductive arguments are very strong.
It makes no sense for you to try and convince someone of a controversial conclusion if you're using premises that they do not agree with.
Right.
You need to construct arguments where you use premises that are uncontroversial, basically, at least to the people you're speaking
to. Or premises,
if they accept that, then they will accept the conclusion.
Show that the premises in my argument, that we either should not accept them or that they're false. Let's take the first cause argument. You haven't shown any evidence we should reject the claim that something can't come from nothing. And you agree there's no evidence that the universe is infinite. So you'd have to provide evidence against my view that the universe is finite, or a critique of any of that evidence. But I haven't heard any of that tonight to critique together.
That's not correct. I'm appealing to counterexamples, and when you're making a deductive case, the onus is on the person making the argument, if it's a deductive argument. And
the only one you gave was the A theory. If you want to continue your time, you can. Can you give us an argument against the A theory? I didn't hear one tonight.
As I said, we don't need to argue for these things because I want to focus on the alternatives. You haven't made a case for theism, only for supernaturalism.
Raphael, you can now begin your cross-examination.
Okay. Well, your case, whether it's probabilistic or deductive, should seriously consider all the evidence, all the alternatives, and give us a number. That sounds silly because I said even if deductive, but as I said, your deductive arguments didn't actually lead to theism. It led to supernaturalism. So in the end, you do need a probabilistic case. I basically wonder, why haven't you done this? Why hasn't it occurred to you? I mean, other Christian philosophers have realized they need to do this, like Richard Swinburne. I think that's fantastic. He did it. Even Craig admits that the use of Bayesian reasoning here is a good thing. He doesn't always do it. Plenty of apologists actually do this. They use the Bayesian reasoning, probabilistic reasoning. I wonder why you refuse to do that and just take refuge with your deductive arguments that even if they worked, even if we grant that they work, don't actually lead to theism. They only lead to supernaturalism. So I wonder why you are so opposed to the probabilistic idea.
So basically you're asking, if all my other Christian apologist friends jumped off a cliff, would I go do it too? I mean, they have their approaches and I have mine. I've chosen to use deductive reasoning to just simply reason from what we observe logically to the conclusion. And a deductive argument is a fine way to argue as long as you can show the premises are true and there's no error in the reasoning. Tonight, none of the arguments have been shown to have fallacies that I used, not one. And I think that there's just been sort of a skepticism toward the evidence for the premises. Well, maybe it could be something else. But as you said earlier in the debate...
Well, that's the whole point with deductive arguments. The onus is on the person making the claim to actually make sure that those premises are are true. And if people disagree with it, there's not much you can do.
There's not much. You're
going to have to make
that's
a
every
probabilistic
argument.
case.
If people don't disagree with you, you just have to say, as you would down here, well, g'day. I mean, that's
Well,
you'll
why
reach
it's so
an impasse
difficult.
sometimes.
That's
that
why
doesn't.
it's so difficult to make a deductive argument. That's the whole point. It's
Do
a very,
people
very
ever
difficult
reject
thing to do.
inductive or probabilistic arguments because they don't agree with the premises? Because you could reject them by saying, for example, you disagree with the prior probability, or you disagree with the assigned consequent probability. So I don't mean to ask the questions, but that would affect your case just as much as it affects mine.
Sure you can reject it. I'm not sure that actually applies equally to me, because you've picked one of the possibilities and said this is the truth. I haven't done that. As I said, I'm happy to wallow in the quagmire of agnosticism. I'm here to point out problems with your case. And as I said, even if your deductive arguments worked, they don't actually lead to theism. That's the whole point. That's my main point that I'm making here tonight. That leads to supernaturalism. So I wonder why you refuse to actually make a case for theism rather than just generic supernaturalism.
This question is like, Trent, why haven't you stopped beating your wife yet? I reject the way the question has been framed. I did make a case for theism. The premises follow.
That is not a case for theism. That is a case for supernaturalism. It could work on deism.
Well,
I'm
going to answer your question because you asked it. I gave an argument that from contingency would rely, you would follow from
I have another question for you. We're running out of time here.
All right.
I would like to know why there is such a dichotomy with Christian apologists and the issue of eternality and infinities. It seems like that Christian apologists like to say infinity is impossible, but you know what? God can have infinite qualities. It seems to me that Christian apologists keep saying it's impossible that the world would be eternal, and yet God is allowed to be eternal. So I wonder, what allows you to say that? How do you know that the universe, which we know exists, cannot be eternal, while God, who we don't even know exists, is eternal? How do you get to say that? And the same thing with the infinite thing. Why say that infinities are impossible and then, okay, you know what, when it comes to the qualities for God, they're allowed to be infinite?
Yeah, what Christian apologists
Why is that?
What I would say is that there are different kinds of infinity. We would argue that infinite collections of things in the real world are impossible. Infinity only exists as a mathematical concept or exists for immaterial realities. In fact, the mathematicians Ed Kasner and James Newman say the infinite does not exist in the same sense we say there are fish in the sea. Existence in the mathematical sense is different from existence of objects in the physical world. So we would say that the universe can't be infinite because you can't have an infinite collection formed by addition, or you can't have an infinite collection of things because that leads to contradictions. God, however, when we say God is infinite, we don't mean he's an infinite collection of items. We just mean that God is not limited. His knowledge is not limited. His existence is not limited. His power is not limited.
Why can't the universe be unlimited in the same ways that God is unlimited, and eternal in the same way that God is eternal? Keeping in mind, we all know that the universe exists. We don't all agree
God's
that God
eternality has been classically understood that to be timeless. That God creates time, so God does not change. He's not subject to time. All of God's life is present in one eternal moment, or he has the perfect possession of interminable life. So eternality there refers more to perfect, timeless, whole existence.
Why can't the universe be timeless in that way?
Because we're having a debate right now that's going on. It can't. Obviously, the universe isn't timeless because we have times happening right now.
We perceive time in a tensed manner, and we are talking about our localized universe. But there are possibilities with multiverses and such. There could be a substratum as well. Also, it's quite interesting if the universe can't be eternal in your view, and God can be. What about in pantheism, where you basically have the universe as God? We can basically both be right. You can then have a universe that's eternal and an eternal God.
Well, there, if you're just saying the universe is God, one, I don't see why you wouldn't just use Occam's razor and just say you have a non-divine universe. What's the difference between a divine universe and a non-divine universe?
Yeah, but if we used Occam's razor, we wouldn't even be having this discussion because you just stop at naturalism.
No, because you can use the razor that simpler explanations aren't always the best. If you just cut away agents, if they create more complexities and more problems. For example, if you come into someone's home and they're lying on the ground and the knife is in their back, you could say, well, the simplest explanation is the knife fell from the cupboard, landed in the back. No agents. But actually there, if you remove an agent causation, it's more complex. My argument tonight is that adding an agent that has caused and sustained the world is the simplest and most plausible explanation for the effects we see.
Yeah, I don't accept that, but moving on.
Nobody's perfect.
I would like to know, how do you know, I mean, I've heard you say this before, you can't confuse moral ontology with moral epistemology. But it seems disingenuous to claim that there is an objective standard of morality when you have no idea what it actually is. How do you know what it is? Do we derive it from the Bible? You mentioned rape before, yet there are horrible things in the Bible. There's rape, there's genocide that the Israelites are...
Right, it describes sinners and they get their just desserts. Yeah.
How do you actually know? Well, you just said rape is objectively wrong, and yet the Israelites are allowed to rape the Midianites and whoever. How do you know what objective morality actually is?
How do I know what it is?
How do you know what it is? Yeah, you claim to know that it exists, but how do you know actually what it is? It seems like it's pretty useless information.
No, you have, one, you can come to it by reason, that human beings have a natural moral faculty. And the fact of the matter is that universally almost all humans agree on morality. They agree that...
That's not actually true.
Yeah,
can
you tell me a society that values cowardice over heroism? Because I've never heard of one.
We only see subjective moralities. I mean, there's cultures that think cannibalism is fine, and there's cultures that think cannibalism is awful. I mean, how do we decide that? How do you know what's actually morally true?
That was riveting, thank you so much. Now we're going to open it up to questions and answers from the audience. So we will now allow any member of the audience to ask our speakers questions about their respective positions. If you have a question for a speaker, please, Francis will get a microphone to you. And if you have a question for Mr. Horn, we'll go with Mr. Horn first, followed by Mr. Lataster. So I'm going to alternate the questions. So does anyone have a question for Trent?
All right. Okay, so I'm not as smart as you both, so if you answer this question in advance and I didn't get it, I apologize. And if you can elaborate on this. It's a double-fold question. One thing is, why do you think that the universe must have a start in terms of time, but then, therefore, there is a God, but then the argument dies there. God doesn't have a start. Why you insist that the universe must have a starting point, which proves the existence of God, when God cannot have a starting point? Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does. The philosophical argument that I gave tonight was that if you form a successive series, that if the universe did not have a beginning, the past would be infinite. But I made an argument that the past is formed by successively, day after day after day. So today, the present will become the past tomorrow. And so the past is formed successively. But in order for the past to be infinite, then you would have had to successfully add enough days to create an infinite number of days. But you can't form an infinite succession by adding one member at a time, just as you can't count an infinite number of flowers in a flower shop one at a time. So I can reason, therefore, that the past is not infinite. It was not formed successfully in an infinite way. It has to be finite due to the way that time is. God, however, is not composed of temporal events. God doesn't have days in his life. I'm not observing that. There has to be some sort of cause, and whatever this cause is, if it made time, it would have to be timeless to make time itself. And I would say the only argument that was broached in the debate against that view is that my view relies on something called the A theory of time. And my opponent has said, well, there's evidence against that. Fine. It wasn't brought up in the debate tonight. Well, lots of people don't believe in it. Okay, well, there's lots of theories. We can't count heads. We have to look at the evidence, and I think the evidence is very strong for the case that I made. Just as there's other, and in fact, the matter is there's lots of people who do believe, much the same. It's a rival theory. Just as in quantum mechanics, there are 10 different interpretations. Some have only a few practitioners. They're still viable options, but I've given evidence for my view, and there's been no evidence presented against it.
Raphael, if you have 1 minute to respond.
Okay, when it comes to these examples that show that infinity is absurd, that actually doesn't prove that infinities are impossible. I defer to our esteemed colleague Graham Oppie, who has this brilliant quote, "Embrace the absurdity." Just because it's absurd doesn't mean that it's wrong. As for the A theory and B theory, I find it very hard to accept the A theory. I admit most of my knowledge about the A theory comes from William Lane Craig. He wrote a whole book on it, for which he is well respected, and I actually read the book, and it's very theological. He basically says we can't have the B theory because then Jesus' death on the cross accomplishes nothing. Then there's no real creation. So it's all very circular. It's like, okay, you accept the A theory because you believe in God, and you believe in God through the Kalam argument because of the A theory. So the whole thing seems very circular. Also, the B theory, or the eternalist theories, there's many theories, seems quite plausible. Most philosophers of time who are experts on time, they actually support these views, but there is evidence as well with different animals that perceive time differently to how we perceive time.
Okay, now we've got a question for Raphael.
Raphael, this is just a question on polytheism, which you brought up. And as Aristotle argues, everything material needs two parts, matter and form. And for instance, I have the form of a human, and what makes me different to you is the material that differentiates us. Now, I'm interested to know, in order to have more than something, you need to have a principle of differentiation in either matter or form. So I guess my question is, if polytheism is true, all gods would have the same form as being God, and both are immaterial. Now, so the principle of differentiation cannot be in matter and form then, as they're all God and they're material. So my question is, what is the principle of differentiation amongst the gods if polyism is true?
I don't think there actually needs to be in the way that you're saying. I don't see any reason why there couldn't be more than one God, and that is an issue that has never really been dealt with seriously by apologists. All we ever get is the appeal to simplicity. That's all we ever get. I'd also like to point out that polytheism is, on a natural view of religion, on the natural history of religions, which at least I think most people can agree with me here when at least it comes to the non-Christian religions. Polytheism is a natural development from observations of the world, going from a default naturalistic view into totemism, to pantheism, animisms, and then to polytheism, where you have all these gods running around. And then eventually you get henotheism and monolatrism. Finally you get monotheism, because there's sort of a divine arms race going on. No, my God's bigger and badder than your God. No, my God's bigger. So you have the infinite God in the end. Polytheism really fits. It's older than monotheism. It fits well into the timeline of natural history of religions. And actually it's what's behind Christianity through Judaism. The early Israelites were actually polytheists. We have plenty of evidence for that. There's no real philosophical reason to reject polytheism except this appeal to simplicity, which I can even grant. I can grant that makes monotheism more likely. We still need to look at the probability distribution. That argument still has to be made. You can't just say we're going to ignore all these polytheisms because monotheism is more likely. You actually need to look at the probability distribution and figure out, does it make theism likely overall or monotheism likely overall? It still could lose. You could have, say, 30% monotheism, 10% for bitheism, 10% for tritheism, etc., and it's still overwhelmed by the polytheisms as a catch-all. And that's unfortunately never been done. I hope it does get done. I would like to see better cases for theism. I would like to see theists really take these challenges seriously. And that's actually where the discussion seems to be going nowadays in philosophy of religion, realizing there's other isms. It's not just about theism and monotheism.
Yeah, to me, this just seems to neglect the entire history of Western thought on this subject. That obviously Aristotle, in his book Metaphysics, argued and said the gods of Greek mythology were myths, that there could only be one infinite and unlimited prime mover. You had Justin Martyr, Augustine, others who were arguing when polytheism, among many people, was the happening thing of the day. So theists have looked at this, and there's many good reasons to reject polytheism. There couldn't be more than one God with a capital G, because God, by definition, is a necessary, unlimited being. Take one of God's key attributes, omnipotence, all-powerful. If there's more, could there be two omnipotent beings? Well, could one destroy the other? well, then they're not really omnipotent, so they're not really God with a capital G, they're God with a lowercase g. I think the arguments I showed that there has to be an unlimited necessary reality, a reality that's perfect being and perfect goodness that has no deficiencies or flaws, would have to be one and united, and so that would be one God or monotheism.
But that's defining
Oh,
God
no,
into
no,
existence.
no, no, that, you know the rules, you can't respond now.
She winked at me.
Do we have a question for Raphael? Oh, sorry, it's for Horn now. A question for Trent Horn. Got one up the back.
Okay, so this is a fairly complicated question, but bear with me here. So, if God created man in his image and is interested in loving every one of us and intervening in our world, why would God go to all the trouble of creating hundreds of billions of galaxies, then design the process of evolution, wait 13.7 billion years to create humans, let billions of humans being die for somewhere between 98 to 248,000 years, depending on who's estimating, with heaven watching with complete indifference, children and women dying with horrible deaths, and then decide, oh, it's about time to send Jesus and save everyone? If God is perfect and the most intelligent conceivable being, this seems extremely wasteful and incompetent or merely indifferent. How can you explain this?
Is that Hitchens? More or less. I believe that was from one of Christopher Hitchens' works. Okay, so the argument is, why would God allow all this time and allow people to not believe in him? Once again, it's an atheistic argument, so the burden of proof is on those who are an atheist to say God has no compelling reasons to do this. And I can just think of some possible reasons, and that's all I have to come up with. Number one, it could be the case that we are not alone in the universe. Maybe God has created life in many other worlds, and there's far more life that we know of. Maybe God wants to create through the evolutionary process because that unites all of creation together, and it unites the human race together, and God desires to create in this way. And maybe he wants to make a big, grand universe. Maybe a small one wouldn't be befitting for an omnipotent God. Also, humans who've died, this argument also assumes that what if humanity continues for another 1,000 years, or 10,000 years, or 100,000 years, and populates the whole universe, and other civilizations come to know God? Well, then the small number of people on Earth and in prehistoric times who didn't know God would be very, very small. Also, I would say that they probably did know God because God can reveal himself through conscience. He reveals himself through natural intelligence, the awareness that there's the great, fascinating, tremendous mystery of God. Can we hit the black over there, by the way? That would be helpful. So I would say that there's no reason in this argument to show God doesn't exist just because he wants to take a lot of time and create humans in a certain way. He's eternal. He's got all the time in the world. And many people have come to know God, and we don't know there won't be belief for another thousands or tens of thousands of years. And those who died in prehistoric times, they probably did know God. And I would reject the view that monotheism is not ancient. King Akhenaten in Egypt in the 14th century BC promoted monotheism. And the earliest works in Judaism, like the book of Job or Genesis, do speak of a robust monotheism.
Well, I didn't say monotheism wasn't ancient. I said that polytheism's older. Animism's too. Monotheism is a relatively late development. As for the actual question, it seems that you're basically talking about the universe being quite inefficient. God could have made it, sped things up a bit, made it not so vast. And that's not a proof against God's existence, but this, again, it is evidence. It works in a probabilistic case. I think there is something there that does go against this all-powerful theistic God, and would either be more expected on naturalism, where you've got basically most of the universe is hostile to life, and hey, here's this little pocket we can exist in, or it better fits, again, these alternative isms, these alternative supernaturalisms, like an indifferent God, a deistic God, etc. So there is something there. It's not a proof against God, but it does work in a probabilistic case against the theistic God.
Thank you. Can we have a question for Raphael?
Okay, so I'm certainly not proposing some kind of like democracy of truth, but I'd like to know how you would explain the lack of public intellectuals, prominent people who would identify as deist. It seems to be an extremely marginal belief. superficially sort of quite convincing, but it doesn't seem to have much of a presence on the intellectual landscape. I wonder how you explain that as a philosopher of religion.
Are you asking me why there's not many prominent theists? Deists. I think the problem with deism is that it works largely as a stepping stone. I myself was a deist. I have an interesting spiritual history, and I kept trying to cling to the faith. Every time I thought, oh, this is one more reason to not accept Christianity anymore, I kept clinging to some sort of belief, and I ended up at deism, and I thought, okay, so deism makes sense because now we don't have to believe in the miracles and such, which are very hard to argue for, but I can still believe in God as the fine-tuner and creator of the universe, and then eventually see, you know what, I don't even have the evidence for that God. There's really no accountability with a deistic God. I might as well just admit it. I'm an agnostic. So, but there are deists out there. I personally don't know any deists. I don't think that matters so much in philosophy of religion, because we're focusing on different God concepts and how plausible they may be. We're not really interested in how many people, taking a vote, how many people vote for these ones. I mean, most people today, I think, are theists, maybe half of them. That's going down. Alternative spiritualities are on the up. I think the pantheisms will be dominant one day. And before monotheism was on the scene, it was polytheism. And even the ancient Israelites were polytheistic. We have the evidence that they were henotheistic and then monotheistic. So I'm not sure we can go down that path. You can also say that about Christianity and Islam. I mean, Christianity is the biggest religion now. Does that have any bearing on whether it's true? But Christianity was really small once compared to other faiths, compared to paganisms, and Islam is probably going to overtake Christianity. So we don't really focus, I think, in philosophy of religion on how many people believe a certain concept. It's more about, is this concept coherent? I mean, could this work out? Is this a serious challenge to this view and to this argument?
Yeah, I actually agree, fancy that deism is kind of a stepping stone. For example, for my life, I was a deist all the way up through the middle of high school. Believed there was a first cause, but an impersonal one. But I felt, as Raphael did, that did not fully explain the way the world is. Now for me, I went in the other direction, that I thought that the ultimate reality has to be more than deistic, it's theistic. There are some prominent deists, not a lot of them. Paul Davies is a deistic physicist who wrote a great book called The Cosmic Jackpot, and he argues that the fine-tuning that we see in the universe, it makes the most sense that it's from some kind of deistic or single supernatural entity that caused it. So that's something you may want to check out.
Okay, we've got a question here for Mr. Trent Horn. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, hi. You touched on this this idea that the universe or the world was made just so for us. It's been touched on a few times. And even if I was to accept that, and I don't, because most of the universe, most of the Earth, is a very dangerous place. But if I would accept that, and that all the ducks lined up in a row, and it's so improbable we got here, well, just in probability, if you go down the probability distribution and the ball drops and it's got to land somewhere. So why do you have to say, rather than just saying the ball landed somewhere and we are the product of that, how lucky are we? Why do you have to say it must have been God?
Well, I would say that I would agree with you. Many parts of the universe and Earth are hostile. I was given fair warning before coming to this country. Watch out for things that slither and creep around. They might be your last days. But the fine-tuning argument doesn't say the universe is the optimal place for design. It just says that it is fantastically more likely. And I was using odds of double, exponents 1 in 10 to the 120th power, odds that are worse than finding random atoms in the universe. It's much more likely there would be no life at all in the universe. The universe would be a lifeless place rather than one where complex embodied life forms can live. And you say, well, maybe the ball just happened to land there and we're here, so what's the big deal? John Leslie is a philosopher who offers a great counterexample to this. He says, imagine there's 50 marksmen and you're on trial in a foreign country and you get the death penalty. They raise their guns and say, ready, aim, fire. And then all the bullets go and you realize, I'm still here. Now would you say, well, the bullets all had to go somewhere. I just might as well assume that they just happen to all land around me, no matter how fantastically improbable that is. Well, that's a self-selection fallacy. I would say that in that case, if you're justified in believing the fact that you're alive and the bullet's trajectory is designed and explains you're alive, the fact that the constants and laws of nature are the way they should be, even though it's fantastically improbable that they should be that way for life to exist, then I think we should conclude for design in that case as well.
I find the fine-tuning argument very interesting because we don't actually know that it is improbable. This is the only universe we've seen. These are the only laws that we've observed. We don't know it could be any other way. Also, what I find interesting about fine-tuning is that several philosophers, Sobel, Jeffrey Nikitas, they've actually turned it on its head and made it an argument against God's existence. And I think that's fascinating. We have less than a minute now, so I can't really give you the full argument. The basic idea is that the relationship between the evidence and the hypothesis fits 100% with naturalism and fine-tuning. I mean, we wouldn't be here to observe ourselves without a God. We wouldn't be here unless there was a natural fine-tuning. However, with God, it's not 100%. It's arguably closer to 0%. And the reason is God could have sustained our life without natural fine-tuning. And that's another thing that has biblical precedent, like Jonah in the belly of the whale, Daniel's friends in the lion's den. God could sustain us just with magic, without natural fine-tuning. So it actually can be made as an argument against God's existence.
Okay, do we have a question for Raphael? Yep.
Raphael, you stood there at the beginning and said, "If God revealed himself to me, I may believe." Is it possible, or is it probable, at any level, that perhaps God has revealed himself to maybe a vessel that is completely closed to that revelation? Would that be a probability?
It would be hard for me to say that would be impossible. I work with probabilities. But as I indicated before, I think no matter what it would take, God would know, God would have the knowledge, if God's all-knowing, all-powerful, etc., God would have the knowledge to be able to figure out what it would take to convince me. And God would have the power to do so, and because God is supposed to be all-loving, God would want to do that. So that's what disturbs me about that argument, is that nothing could stop God from doing that. And it wouldn't infringe on my free will if God did make that obvious to me, because I could still choose not to follow God. But I'm not like that. You might have to take my word for it. Kind of doesn't matter, because you've got an omni-being anyway that should be able to convince me either way. But I'm being very honest with that. I have no problem with religion and God and Christianity. If God revealed himself to me, I would accept it. I would follow God. I don't think there's much more I can say about that. I'm completely open to it. My only crime would be if I don't accept God. It's that I wasn't convinced of it. That's my crime. If I end up in hell, it's a possibility. If I end up with hell with all the cool people, I think my only crime, well, Hendrix at least, but whatever. If I end up in hell, I think my only crime is that I just wasn't convinced. I kind of would be cheeky and say, "Well, it's your fault, God. You didn't convince me hard enough." But I wouldn't oppose. If I was convinced of it, if I was genuinely convinced of it, I would accept it and I would follow God. That's not a problem for me.
I'm not going to comment on my distinguished opponent's personal acceptance or rejection of God. I will say that this argument, however, there is an assumption in it that's not probabilistic that his answer revealed. It's that if God existed, then he would ensure that no one lacked belief in him. But the problem is, it doesn't refute an additional premise to the argument, which is God may have good reasons to allow non-belief. We need more evidence to show why couldn't God have those good reasons. And I offered one, the idea about free will, but that's just one possible reason for some people. For others, it may be God wants us to have the dignity of being able to share him with other people. And I show that in my theological tradition, that lack of belief in God does not entail automatic damnation. So if it doesn't, and if those who don't believe through no fault of their own, maybe they've just made an error in assessing the arguments, I think that may have happened tonight, they won't be penalized for all eternity out of just a mere error. It's a steadfast rejection that will, will lead to their end.
A question for... Yeah, so it's a question for it's a question for Horn, Mr. Trent Horn. Anyone who hasn't asked a question would like to ask one? Yeah? If you just want to come down.
Thank you. You mentioned briefly that a God who created the universe, which has time, must in itself exist outside of time. I'm just curious, how can an entity act in any way without a dimension of time itself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that theologians and philosophers who tried to understand God's timelessness would say that God doesn't act in sequence, but that all that God exists as infinite, simple, and unlimited being. All his knowledge would be immediately present at once, and his will to act on that knowledge would also be immediately present. So God would just be, and anything that follows from his will and intellect would also be, though there may be temporal things that follow from that. So the act of creation itself would reveal time, but it wouldn't be the case that God has to sit around and think, all right, maybe I should create people. That would be a really good idea. Everything that exists in God's intellect and will would be simultaneous and exist in a perfect now, and there would be things that would flow from that, not necessarily, but would proceed from that, and then we would see temporal consequences from it. A good book on that subject actually is God Without Time by Paul Helms. That might be one resource I would recommend on that subject, but I don't see a contradiction in God being timeless and creating spatio-temporal effects.
That is an interesting question, and what I normally see from Christian apologists is that God has God's own time, there's a divine time, which makes me wonder, why can't that apply to the universe, especially if the universe is God? It's a similar issue like with eternality and infinities. If these things can apply to God, why can't they actually apply to the universe, especially if there's more to the universe than we know, which is probably the case. One of these things with time also, quite popular, is that our view of time is shaped by our localized universe. That's what we usually talk about when we're talking about time, and we don't know that that's all there is. I mean, most cosmologists think there's a lot more out there, and time there could be very different. There's many unknowns here, so it makes it very difficult to actually say anything here with certainty, and that, of course, doesn't really work well for theists, but for agnostics it suits fine. I don't have a problem with those uncertainties. I embrace the uncertainty.
Do we have time for more questions?
I thought that was a pun.
Do we have a question for Raphael?
I just wanted to ask, you spoke before about how if you were convinced that a God would exist, you would accept that and then follow him. I'm just wondering, could you justify that? By following him, would you also mean worship him? Like, do you believe, like the actions of the Old Testament, the genocide, the murder, that's all justified, and you would worship him and accept him as a perfect loving God, or would you just accept the fact that he exists?
That's a great question. It depends on, I mean, depending on which God actually revealed itself to me. If I was convinced of it, I think I would have to be consistent and follow that God, for better or for worse, and I'm honest about that. Abraham was tested in a really horrible way, and you can say Abraham was either insane. I mean, plenty of scholars think Abraham didn't even exist, but assuming he existed, was Abraham insane to try and kill his son because God told him? It's consistent with his worldview. He thought God existed. He thought God was his friend. God told him to do that. He has to listen to God. He was about to kill his son. And I think I would think similarly. If I was really convinced that God exists, I would basically have to do whatever that guy said. So it's maybe a good thing I don't believe that God exists.
I guess the way that I would respond to the question, that if God existed because he's perfect goodness itself, he would not, out of necessity, he would not command us to do intrinsically evil things. Now, the sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac goes beyond what I can get into here. I have a book that deals with that and the other stuff, hard stuff in the Bible called Hard Sayings, which you can always pick up, shameless plug. But I would say that even there, that Abraham, the author of the book of Hebrews, said that Abraham did this. He knew that God had made a promise, and God can never break his promises, that Isaac would be his descendant and his seed would flow through Isaac, and believed that even if God commanded him to kill Isaac, God could raise Isaac back from the dead, because Abraham knew God would not go back on his promise. I will say, though, rejecting God just because, well, it could lead to this, bad consequences, any ethical or moral view where you ground something in reason or an ethical standard could lead to something repugnant. It doesn't follow that the view is incorrect. You have to look at the evidence for and against it.
Thanks, Francis. Well, that concludes the questions and answers from the audience. We now have 5 minutes each, starting with Trent for an affirmative closing statement, followed by Raphael's negative closing statement.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight. I'd really like to thank Raphael for taking part in this debate and bringing up these important issues. I think if I had to summarize the theme of tonight's debate, it would be which God, not if God. Because if you notice, the majority of what we spoke about tonight, Raphael really conceded all of the arguments for the existence of God, conceded supernaturalism. I showed that contingent things require a necessary reality. We have no rebuttal. We have someone saying, well, you don't have good evidence, or I did rebut that. And yet the evidence I presented, based on the unique contingency of the world and the necessity for a necessary being, it went unchallenged, as did my arguments for first cause, the fact that the universe is finely tuned, or that there are moral values. Watch the debate again, you'll see the arguments went to the wayside, and we stopped debating the question, if God. It was almost like supernaturalism was granted, which is really not good for atheism if that's the worldview you want to hold to. Rather, it was which God. But contrary to what my opponent has said, I provided evidence that the deistic God or the pantheistic God, that these, and they're not even gods with a capital G, as I said in Q&A, they're limited beings. You would still ask, why these limited beings and not any other? The arguments I gave tonight, and they were not shown to be invalid. The premises were not refuted except with the idea, well, there could be evidence against it, or they could be wrong. But as Mr. Lataster said earlier in the debate, possibility is not probability. So I think these deductive arguments, the premises are likely to be true and they follow, and they lead to a necessary reality that created the finite limited universe. And this unlimited necessary reality, if it was just a bunch of different gods or a material God or the God is the universe, you would still ask, well, if it's 3 gods, why not 4? Why not 5? Why not 2? That if you have more than one, you get contingency back into the fold. Only one unlimited reality provides necessary foundations that ground why we exist instead of nothing at all. Also, I think the fine-tuning, as I showed, counts against at least polytheism, because you have order that is best explained by a single entity. And finally, the moral argument I made, and I think I've made a very good argument that objective morality, that the statement rape is wrong, is a fact. It is a fact, and if people disagree with it, they're just flat out wrong. That there are other objective moral facts. For example, if there were 2 people who are arguing, should we go sailing or go to the movies, it would say it doesn't matter what they choose, it's just a preference. But if they're arguing, should we go sailing or torture a cat this afternoon, you wouldn't have them solve that disagreement by flipping a coin like they would sailing or going to the movies. You would say that some preferences are objectively wrong. There are these moral facts that can only come from a perfectly good person, and I've provided that evidence. And a perfectly good unlimited being is incompatible with deism or pantheism. Rather, I think there is good evidence, and the challenge tonight we've heard is, well, some people don't believe in God. If God existed, why doesn't everyone believe? And that's a question, not an argument. An argument would show reasons why God would not allow non-belief, and we didn't hear that tonight. But I would just say that there is good evidence, and if you don't believe, look at the evidence. Give it a second look. Maybe you haven't fully looked at it. Maybe you haven't fully grasped or understood one of the arguments or a rebuttal to it. I have a whole book on that. Many people do. I would just say search for the truth, and don't let other people say that, well, that's all been refuted. Look it up for yourself and trust your own judgment of that. And God will guide you to that, and he'll be loving and merciful towards you, whatever you follow your conscience to be, to come to know him, because he loves you and desires that. So thank you very much.
Okay, my primary aim was to not only review inadequacies with Trent's deductive case, which I did very briefly, but to focus on the alternatives as well. And the reason for that is because this debate was to be a debate over classical theism, which is what we agreed to. And you can't just ignore the supernaturalistic alternatives there. I, out of the kindness of my heart, just to make the debate a bit more focused, a bit more simple, said I'll grant supernaturalism. I don't accept it in reality. I am a de facto naturalist. Now, what I did, I acknowledge, I very briefly looked at some of the problems with Trent's arguments for God. I noted the most important thing is that they're not actually arguments for theism. We're talking about capital G-O-D. It's actually arguments for supernaturalism, because other isms, other supernaturalisms can still work on that evidence. And I also presented some reasons to think that God doesn't exist in terms of the arguments against God's existence, like argument from gratuitous suffering, argument from divine hiddenness. These don't prove that God doesn't exist, but they work in a probabilistic framework of showing that the evidence is more consistent with there being no God or there being a different kind of God. And that, of course, leads us back into the alternative supernaturalisms again. We haven't really seen anything from Trent why we should ignore all these. He just said then about deism, that deism's not unlimited, and I think, okay, well, that's actually true, but so is theism. Theism's not unlimited either. I don't see why you'd see a difference there with deism and theism. The only real difference with the deisms and the quasi-deisms is that God is not a revelatory being, or that God is not a revelatory being towards humankind. So there's nothing there that says actually theism is simpler than the deisms and the quasi-deisms. So there was nothing there to deal with that subset of alternative monotheisms. As for pantheism not being limited and theism apparently not being unlimited, and theism actually is unlimited, I find that astounding, because I work with the ontological argument, which says that God is this omni-being, and so that actually leads me towards pantheism. I don't think the ontological arguments work, by the way, but if they do work, they lead to pantheism, I would argue, because these are the greater God concepts. This is a God that truly is not limited. Unlike the God of theism, the God of pantheism, or the gods of pantheism, are not actually limited by the nothing, by the creation. Just everything that is God. So to me, I think that is actually the greater God, the unlimited God. Also, there was a lot of talk about atheism, that I had to justify atheism. What is atheism? I gave my definition of atheism. Atheism simply means not theism. And we were here to discuss theism. So atheism could mean just anything that's not that, or it could mean atheism in the sense of belief in no gods whatsoever. Atheism doesn't mean that you know that God doesn't exist. I didn't have to demonstrate that at all, and yet I still presented a case for the case for theism being poor. I think that's it, basically. I'm trying to move the discussion away from naturalism and supernaturalism, partly, I think, to make it more interesting. I don't think that is a battle that the supernaturalists have won, but I think moving on from that, it is very interesting. If we're looking at research that's novel, it's very interesting to look at how theism struggles against the alternative supernaturalisms. When you argue for supernaturalism, you don't automatically get to theism. There's all these other alternatives that you have to factor in, and you really have to do that. Unless you can rule them out deductively, you have to factor that into a probabilistic analysis. And some Christian philosophers do this. We didn't see Trent do it, but some do this to an extent, not what I'm talking about, but they do realize you need to actually argue probabilistically. And I think that's all for me tonight. I thank you all for coming. I thank Trent for coming as well. I think that's been at least my best debate, the best opponent I've been up against. So yeah, I think it's a relatively decent case for theism, and I think I've presented a good case for not theism, not for atheism. All right, so I think that's it. Thank you very much for coming, and happy to have a chat afterwards as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes the formalities for tonight's debate. I'll now hand over to Francis Tamer, the President of the Sydney University Catholic Society, to thank our speakers.
Thank you everyone for coming tonight. We'd like to thank Trent Horn and Perusia Media for organising the Trent Horn tour. Trent has been going across universities and parishes doing talks on pro-life issues, on the existence of God. I think the tour is love, life and family? And marriage, hence family. So if we could all just thank Trent and Perusia Media. And also to Mr. Raphael Lataster, who attends Sydney University as a PhD student. He has debated across other universities before. I've seen him at UNSW. So to hear that tonight was one of his best opponents. It shows the quality of the speakers here tonight. Thank you. I would like to extend also a thank you again to Perusia Media for pretty much organising this. It takes a lot of time, effort and money to bring out speakers from overseas and organise events like this for students. Both Trent and Raphael will have their books on sale outside for purchase. So please, if you are interested in what either side has to say, believer or non-believer, I'm sure you'll find all resources very valuable. Now, I think Raphael was saying if he was convinced he would convert tonight. We did have a priest on standby, so we do need an answer so that he can go home because he looks pretty tired. So, do we have a verdict?
I wasn't convinced, unfortunately.
Not convinced.
Maybe next time.
Maybe next time.
I'm always hopeful.
Probably next time.